On January 8, 1815, British aggressors marched against New Orleans, determined to take the city and gain control of the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase Territory. In a battle that lasted less than an hour, American troops, led by General Andrew Jackson, defeated the more experienced British Army and secured the growth of the new nation.
These are the saviors of their country. These the patriot soldiers who triumphed over the invincibles of Wellington and conquered the conquerors of Europe. You have secured to America a proud name among the nations of the earth, a glory which will never perish.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm J. Dardenne, Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, and your host for this evening. The final major battle of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, took place on the grounds of the Chalmette Plantation. To better understand the importance of that victory and its effects on our state and nation, I'm joined by a panel of experts. Ronald J Dresden is an award-winning author and former U.S. Marine captain who served in combat in Vietnam. Drez's recent book, The War of 1812, Conflict and Deception, offers a perspective of the British attempt to seize New Orleans and void the Louisiana Purchase. Jason Wiese is a curator at the Historic New Orleans Collection. His subject specialties include the maritime and military history of the Gulf South, especially the Battle of New Orleans. He has curated several exhibitions, most recently, Andrew Jackson, Hero of New Orleans. Gary Joyner serves on the Battle of New Orleans Bicentennial Commission and is the chair of the Department of History and Social Sciences at LSU in Shreveport. Dr. Joyner is the author of numerous publications, including Mr. Lincoln's Brown Water Navy, Mississippi Squadron. And Patricia Brady is a social and cultural historian who has published extensively. Her publications include Martha Washington, An American Life, and A Being So Gentle, the frontier love story of Rachel and Andrew Jackson. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And Jason, let me start with you. Kind of give us a sense of place as to what America looked like, what Louisiana looked like in December of 1814, January of 1815, as this battle was about to develop.
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to understand the critical importance of New Orleans as a city in 1814. New Orleans was the principal Western American port. It served the entire Trans-Appalachian West. It is the port that made the western United States economically feasible in the days before steam, power, and railroads. The city itself was a cosmopolitan, growing city of about 20,000 people in 1814, almost evenly split between white and black residents. Many of the people of color in New Orleans were enslaved, but there was also a sizable free-colored community. New Orleans, even though it was a cosmopolitan place, it was widely separated from the rest of the United States. Almost 1,000 miles separated it from the capital of the United States, Washington. There weren't really any good roads to get there, and attacks by Indians and by pirates at sea were ever present. The population was also very different from the rest of the United States. It was very French and Latin in its character. Many people tended to speak French or Spanish instead of English. That Francophone character had been reinforced by the arrival of thousands of refugees from the Haitian Revolution in the years leading up to the War of 1812. So it was an exciting place, to say the least, and it would have been a very interesting and stressful place to be in the autumn of 1814.
Well, so with that backdrop and that lifestyle in New Orleans, here comes Andrew Jackson, a non-Louisianian, a frontiersman. And Ron, with a distinct leadership skill and ability, and talk a little bit about your perspective on Andrew Jackson and what his significance was to bringing all these disparate groups together.
Yes, well, Andrew Jackson was a commander looking for a command. He had a terrible hatred for the British. He had been slashed by a British officer for failing to polish his boots. Most of his family perished in the Revolution. And he offered his services to the United States, which were routinely turned down. But in 1814, the United States was looking for someone to fight and defeat the Indian threat in the Mississippi Territory that had led to a number of atrocities and terrorized the population in those far-flung places, and he was the man that did it. He defeated the Creek Indians, and suddenly he rose in esteem, and he was appointed to become the new military commander of the 7th Military District, which would be headquartered in New Orleans. Now, when he came to New Orleans, what Jason was talking about, this diverse population was terrified. They had known about the British Army. The British Army didn't necessarily follow the rules of the Marquis de Queensberry. Lots of atrocities, beauty and booty were war cries, and the rape at Hampton and Havre de Grace were fresh in everyone's mind. So this diverse population of Italians and Greeks and Portuguese and all these people that made up New Orleans knew that if the British came, this was not going to be good news for them. When he comes, he is greeted with such anticipation that the whispered word spreads through the city that Jackson is here. This is the savior to come. Well, Jackson realizes he has a very diverse population to deal with. Governor William Claiborne has sort of prefaced it by writing him a letter saying, "You don't know the difficult population I deal with here." And he makes no pretensions to say that you're going to find a ready fighting force. In fact, you're going to find the exact opposite, a force that is diverse, knows little about the military, and can't really promise him a victory. And he comes and takes this unit, this population, and the first thing he does is put them at ease by sending a balcony, and most likely for the first time, a simultaneous translation of what he said into both French and Spanish, and says to them, "Be calm, I'm here," and then later on makes some very famous comments, "They shall not enter except over my dead body."
When did he come to New Orleans?
He arrives on the night of November the 30th, and he first is seen on the 1st of December, and he instantly takes that time and addresses the population on December the 2nd, and then goes on a whirlwind inspection tour of every possible avenue of approach that the British can come. He's a very astute military commander. He only had, in effect, 10 days from the 2nd until the 12th of December when the British are first sighted headed in this direction. And in that time, he has defenses built. He reinforces various things. He's also facing terrible political decisions. The Louisiana legislature is not very keen about this. In fact, part of them want to surrender. And so then he declares martial law.
Part of Jackson's decision to declare martial law, which, by the way, was unprecedented for an American general officer, he had been, like Ron says, receiving communication from Governor Claiborne for weeks saying that the population of Louisiana is disaffected. But Jackson was also aware that the British were wanting to exploit that cultural difference between Louisianans, the Francophone and Spanish-speaking Louisianans, and the English-speaking United States. And in fact, there was a proclamation issued by a lieutenant colonel, a brevet lieutenant colonel in the Royal Marines, Edward Nichols, encouraging the people of Louisiana to rise up against the American government. Jackson was well aware of this, and his declaration of martial law was part of his insurance, just taking no chances with this vital American outpost.
Well, Gary, let me bring you in. This battle had two renowned generals, well known for their fighting abilities, their leadership skills. So Jackson's adversary is General Pakenham. Tell us about Pakenham and his role in the British Army, and particularly in this battle.
Edward Pakenham was the second choice to come to Louisiana. The British High Command wanted the Leopard, the head of the British Army, Lord Wellington, to do it. He said no, but I will send a very capable officer, which was his brother-in-law, and that's Sir Edward Pakenham.
Is there a sense that he underestimated the fighting will and strength of Andrew Jackson and this ragtag group of Louisianians?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. He's used to fighting set-piece battles with Napoleonic armies, against Napoleonic armies. Huge numbers of men on a nice flat plain where you can maneuver. And he finds himself between an impassable cypress swamp and the Mississippi River. And the only way that he can approach, by the time he gets there, is a frontal assault. So he's going to try to pull Jackson out of his defenses and make him come to the British. and Jackson's no fool, he's not going to do it.
So what Jackson did do was build this rampart on the battlefield in Chalmette and arm it with this ragtag group of Louisianians. Pat, kind of describe the army that existed that Jackson had to bring together, had to train, and particularly the role of free people of color.
Well, one of the things I think that, first of all, people need to know is that Jackson was in terrible health. He had been in a brawl in Nashville not so very long ago, and his shoulder had been shot and he had been stabbed, and he had bits of bone floating up from his skin from the bad breaks. He had also had dysentery. So he came, he was like a skeleton. He was so weak, and yet his will so overcame his body that he dove right in, and he took decisions that the governor did not like. He and the governor had been very close as young men, but they'd had a falling out, and he disliked and distrusted the governor. And so the governor was saying, well, maybe you shouldn't take the nice people of town. We'll just have the upper class, that'll be fine. And he's going, are you crazy? Those are not enough men. And so then the militias of free people of color, which had been started under the Spanish, came and offered their services. And Jackson, over the disquiet of some of his other supporters, said, yes, by God, these men who actually often served as slave chasers during the Spanish regime, they want to fight. And it's not to protect their country, because it's not as if Louisiana at that time was a very favorable situation for them. It was because they wanted to protect their status as men, that to have honor was to be a military fighter, to win, to overcome, meant you were important and you were a man. And black manhood, of course, was something that was so frequently put down. And the same way with the pirates. You know, when they offered, what they had to offer was men who were accustomed to using artillery. Artillery on board pirate ships, of course, or privateers, but they just unloaded and put it on a wagon and brought it to the field, and then they knew how to really use it. And nobody local except them really was an artilleryman. Without the artillery, who knows what would have happened.
So the army that gathered to defend the city looks nothing like a traditional army taking orders from a general and from a military structure. You have Creoles, you have slave owners, you have slaves, you have free people of color, you have Kentuckians and Tennesseans and Cherokees and pirates.
The number of actual regular army troops is a very minor part of it.
Ron, the Battle of New Orleans is surrounded nowadays with myths,
Yes.
differences in opinion on its significance in the future of America and the future of Louisiana. Give us your view on exactly what the battle meant and the victory for America meant.
Most people focus on the one day, the 8th of January, 1815, but it is a 3-week offensive, a grand offensive that culminates even a grander offensive, that the British whole attack at New Orleans is the last phase of a 3-pronged assault, one through New York at Lake Champlain and Plattsburgh, the second to seize and capture Baltimore, and the third, the finishing battle at New Orleans. All this for the purpose of gaining control in America. What happened on the 8th of December was the final blow for the British to ever achieve this grand offensive strategy. From that moment on, the United States is in the ascendancy, and one can argue from that moment on, the British Empire starts a slow road down.
What if the battle had gone the way of the British? The treaties had not been signed, but it had not been ratified.
Yes.
What would have happened if the British would have regained a stronghold in America? Would the war have continued?
Yes. Of course, remember, the strategy for the British is the same strategy Napoleon wanted to use 10 years earlier. And he had said, a 10,000-man French army entrenched in New Orleans, who's going to throw that out? The British had the same thing, a 10,000-man British army, who was going to throw that out? And they had always, over the years, since 1803, questioned the legality of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, a 10,000-man army on the 8th of January controlling New Orleans, does one think that President Madison would have ever ratified that treaty with the great Mississippi River and New Orleans in the hands of the British. He would not.
I am not convinced that the British Army intended to remain in New Orleans. In fact, that's very contrary to orders from Bathurst, first to General Ross and then to General Packenham. The intention was not for the Army to remain in New Orleans. The intention, had their army succeeded below the city and actually captured the city, was to just garrison it with black troops from the 2 West India regiments that accompanied the expedition, and then for the main army to either move upriver to some safer place, because the British military establishment believed, with some good reason, that New Orleans was not necessarily the healthiest place to quarter one's troops. Their long experience in the West Indies with yellow fever and whatnot gave them some pause about New Orleans. Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister of England, actually wrote a letter to Castlereagh at the Congress of Vienna, and he expressed his expectation that Packenham would be in the area of the Chesapeake sometime in February or early March of 1815. So there doesn't seem to be any expectation at the highest levels of the British government that the British Army would remain in New Orleans. And Bathurst seemed to believe that New Orleans couldn't even be garrisoned for that long.
That there's at least 12 letters, formal letters, talking about seizing New Orleans, nullifying the Louisiana Purchase, and ending this purloined goods that the Great Britain always thought was stolen from them by Napoleon.
When were those letters written, or when did he receive them?
October, well, as he left, it would have been October the 24th, 1814, as he's boarding the ship, Bathurst hands that to him.
Did he ever respond?
No, he just took it with him, and it was part of his orders, and what he would have done, we don't know, because he didn't survive.
Well, that begs a very interesting question as to whether what the Army would have done had there been formal word come that the treaty had been either signed or it wouldn't have been ratified yet.
That's
But
right.
it
His orders were to pay no attention to that.
The order did come from Bathurst. It's a very sensible precaution to issue to an officer who is out on his first independent command, even though Packenham was a seasoned veteran of the Peninsular War. And you know, in the age of sail, it took a while for news to catch up to wherever your army was operating. So it seems like a perfectly reasonable communication that Bathurst would have transmitted. I'm not sure that it conclusively. I mean, Packenham was ordered to continue hostilities until contacted by an emissary of the Prince Regent, specifically Anthony St. John Baker, who brought the ratification to Washington. Treaties, as we observed, treaties don't immediately take effect. They have to be ratified. You know, Andrew Jackson kept martial law in effect in New Orleans until mid-March for much the same reason. The people of New Orleans from mid-January were talking about the peace. They were aware of it. They were clamoring to be released from the restrictions of martial law, and yet Jackson would not do it until he received official word through the chain of command that the peace had been ratified and that hostilities had formally concluded.
In the same way that Packenham would have.
Exactly. I think
you go away and then you find out that the treaty really has been withdrawn, and you look like a fool because you've marched off home and said, oh, it's all over.
Well, Jackson knew that the British Army was encamped on Dauphin Island, just a day's sail away.
Well, there's another factor in that, too, though. Remember that even though Jackson has New Orleans under martial law for roughly 3 months, 2.5 months, he's there as the victor, and he's protecting his gains. Mm-hmm. If Packenham had survived, I think he probably would have shown enough initiative to make policy on his own. He's certainly not the only British officer during that period that did that. We'll never know. It's one of those wonderful what-ifs that we could talk about for years and pleasantly talk about, but we'll never know. It was Bathurst's order was not the only one of its type during this whole period. It's pretty much a regular idea. Do this. This gives you what we want you to do. But then there's this undercurrent of, but we'll never know.
You know, and you also talk about the delay in getting communications as to whether a treaty had been signed, ratified, and imagine the same thing on the flip side. How long did it take Great Britain to know that Pakenham was dead and that the battle had been lost and that their fortunes in this new world
The
were gone?
news didn't arrive in London, I think, until about March 9th is when it appears in the London Times.
Right. The real stumbling block that revisionists have in talking about what the intentions were or were not, it is not a letter that you would send to someone with the idea that, oh, look, if you hear about this, we're really anxious for peace, let's stop attacking. That's just not going to be given. And it's unique in the sense that he talks about if you hear rumors, not saying if you see the document, if you hear rumors. And of course, an examination of the Treaty of Ghent as it came down was nothing more than a glorified ceasefire, was what it was. So all that was going to be hammered out later, but Bathurst wanted to make sure that Pakenham hearing, well, maybe this is over with, I'll hold back, seize New Orleans.
It doesn't matter where the big pile of soldiers are. They were still doing an encirclement, which would have, had they stayed there and made the treaties they would have with the Indians, as they had elsewhere, would have disconnected the whole western Appalachian
I have
part.
no trouble conceding.
The plan was grabbing it all.
I have no trouble conceding Ron's point that it would have been disastrous. It would certainly have derailed that sort of American ascendancy that does begin. I mean, the outcome of the Battle of New Orleans really settles the question of who owns the Louisiana Purchase.
If the British had come into New Orleans, had defeated Jackson, yes, I think there would have been a garrison there. And yes, I think the bulk of the British forces would have been sent back east. But at the same time, the fact that you have a garrison and it can be reinforced shows that you own the choke point. You don't have to hold the whole length of the river. You simply have to control where all the goods come out. And the documents are conflicting, there's no doubt. You've got documents that make sense. You've seen the documents that make sense. And I think it's really a point of opportunism. Do it, and then let's see what we want to do.
Is it safe to say that Andrew Jackson's political rise would not have occurred as it did had that battle been lost?
Oh,
we all agree with that.
Absolutely.
No question.
No question.
It allowed him ascendancy unbelievably quickly and into a realm of, from being a frontier military officer, no matter how good in the Creek War and no matter how good he was leading up to the Battle of New Orleans, but he almost became a demigod.
The American Republic had been around for scarcely a generation at this point, and a lot of people around the country didn't have a strong sense of national identity as Americans. And it's after news from New Orleans comes and spreads up the eastern seaboard that people are inspired to say, well, yeah, maybe this little republic is going to hang on and it's going to work out. And you begin to see in the cultural production of the country, in prints and art that's produced, in songs, images of patriotism and of American identity, and that coincides with Jackson's rise to the White House.
Well, and don't forget, too, that this was, so many defeats had happened. Our capital had just been burnt down. The army,
hadn't won anything.
The British had gone into the White House and eaten the food and drunk the wine and then burned it up, and the Capitol as well, and our president had sensibly left the Capitol. But a British officer in charge overall of the operation wrote and said, maybe next time show them a little bit more the consequences of standing against us. You know, there weren't many atrocities. They were very quiet there. They burned buildings, but they didn't do anything to people.
So without trying to overstate the significance of the battle nationally, it became a rallying cry for young America to beat its chest and overcome the mightiest army and navy in the world, and to preserve the freedoms that young America was enjoying.
We become the victors in what some historians, I think perhaps rightly, have said is the Second American Revolution.
Just want to inject one question about Jean Lafitte, the role that Jean Lafitte played in this entire saga?
Jean Lafitte actually was not present on Chalmette during the final battle. He was stationed somewhere out toward des Allemands in the western area. His brother, however, and his relatives, his half-brothers, Dominic Yu and Renato Bellucci, were there, and they did indeed man the artillery. He's a figure that plays into the Battle of New Orleans because it's his men who were eventually brought into Jackson's army over Jackson's objections. He calls them hellish banditti, wants nothing to do with them, and only when he finds out that they can bring 20,000 flints and powder does he say, okay, well, let's let them in.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We could keep talking about this, I know, for hours on end, but let me ask each of you just a few seconds, just closing thoughts, 10, 15 seconds each. Gary?
I think this was a tremendously important event, not only for the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, but the United States.
Jackson is, in every sense of the word, a supreme commander. There have been 5 supreme commanders in the entire history of the United States. 4 of them, all except Black Jack Pershing, ascend to the presidency.
Jackson really almost consciously modeled himself on Washington. He saw himself as this revolution's Washington, and so did the relatives of Washington,
yes.
And so did Lafayette. And so he was seen by them as the national figure.
Jason, you get the final word.
Well, thank you. I want to return to a point. It's a frequent and enduring misconception about the Battle of New Orleans is that it was fought after the war had ended. That is absolutely untrue. The treaty was signed on Christmas Eve of 1814, as we know, but no treaty ever ends a war in and of itself. Treaties have to be ratified by the signatory governments, and even then, in this case, the war wouldn't be over until the ratifications were formally exchanged. That didn't happen in the case of the War of 1812 until February 16th, 1815, more than a month after the Battle of New Orleans.
Thanks to all of you for joining us and sharing your insights. Thanks to you for tuning in as we remember one of the most important battles in American history, the bicentennial of which being commemorated January 8th, 2015, the Battle of New Orleans.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org. Support comes from the Historic New Orleans Collection and its current exhibition, Andrew Jackson, Hero of New Orleans, on view at 533 Royal Street in the French Quarter through March 29th. Information at hnoc.org. And by Frank MacArthur of Estate Strategies, LLC, working with clients to create a legacy for their families and communities through clarity, confidence, and completion. Information at macarthurstrategies.com. And by the Joseph Sternberg Memorial Fund, supporting Louisiana Public Broadcasting in telling Louisiana's story. And by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting. And by viewers like you.